She thought she could get a black man removed from first class with a few carefully chosen words, but she never expected what would happen next. The airport was alive with the usual chaos. Boarding announcements crackled over the loudspeakers, passengers hurried through the terminal, rolling suitcases trailing behind them, and the scent of overpriced coffee filled the air. Patricia Langford barely noticed any of it. She had taken this flight route too many times before. Dallas to Washington, D.C. first class always. She moved through the airport with the certainty of someone who belonged in the world of private lounges, priority boarding, and complimentary champagne. Everything about air travel had a rhythm, a familiarity that she had grown accustomed to. The hushed tones of businessmen making last-minute calls, the soft clinking of glasses as flight attendants prepared pre-departure drinks, the quiet luxury of exclusivity. That's what first class was supposed to feel like, separate from the crowded, chaotic experience of the rest of the plane. But today, something felt off. As she approached her seat, Patricia's steps slowed, her perfectly curated sense of control slipping just slightly. Seated beside her, already settled in, was a man, a black man, wearing a crisp navy blue suit. He looked utterly unbothered, effortlessly composed. His laptop was open on the tray table in front of him, his fingers moving over the keyboard with ease. His posture was straight, confident, self-assured. There was no hesitation in the way he sat, no second-guessing, no nervous glances around the cabin, as if unsure whether he truly belonged. And that unsettled Patricia. She had flown first class for decades, and never, not once, had she been seated next to someone like him. Her lips pressed into a firm line as she set her designer handbag down a little too forcefully. The man beside her didn't even flinch. She slid into her seat stiffly, adjusting her posture, willing herself to ignore the growing discomfort pressing against her chest. This wasn't the first-class experience she had envisioned for today. A flight attendant passed by, offering warm smiles, pouring drinks. Patricia's hand clenched subtly over the armrest. Why hadn't they said anything? Why hadn't they checked? She exhaled through her nose, carefully composing herself. If no one else was going to say something, then maybe it was up to her. Patricia turned slightly toward him, tilting her head just enough to make it clear she was acknowledging him now. "Excuse me," she said, her voice smooth, controlled. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" For the first time, he paused. Slowly, he lifted his gaze from his laptop, meeting hers with an unreadable expression. His dark eyes held no trace of confusion, no flicker of uncertainty. Yes. That was it. No elaboration, no explanation, no nervous fumbling for a ticket or a boarding pass, just that one simple word, spoken with quiet finality. Patricia blinked. Her fingers curled slightly against the fabric of her dress. She hadn't expected that. He didn't even look at her again. His attention was already back on his laptop, as if the conversation had never happened. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. She inhaled sharply, sitting up straighter. She could feel the tension in her own body, the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her pulse picked up just slightly. Her fingers tapped against her knee. This wasn't right. Something about the way he carried himself, the way he had responded so simply, without hesitation, without offering any justification, left her unsettled, as if he knew something she didn't. Patricia's eyes flickered toward the aisle. The flight attendants were still moving through the cabin, welcoming other passengers, arranging pre-flight details. She had expected them to notice the mistake, to pause, to check the seating chart, to correct what had clearly gone wrong, but no one did. No one was reacting the way she thought they should. The discomfort that had started as a small flicker in her chest grew heavier, hotter. She cleared her throat, shifting in her seat, the movement just slightly more forceful than necessary. The edge of her purse nudged his armrest. Nothing, no reaction, not even a glance in her direction. Patricia's lips pressed together. That was fine. If he wasn't going to acknowledge the situation, then she would handle it herself. She turned slightly in her seat, just enough to catch the attention of a flight attendant walking past. Emily, the young woman in uniform, stopped immediately, offering Patricia a practiced professional smile. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Patricia exhaled, smoothing her expression, tilting her head just slightly, just enough to make it clear that there was something off. "I think there's been a little mix-up," she said lightly, offering a small chuckle, as if amused by the situation. She gestured toward the man beside her with the smallest tilt of her head. "I believe this gentleman might be in the wrong seat." Emily blinked, glancing at the man in question. He didn't react. He didn't even pause in his typing. It was as if he had already expected this. The flight attendant nodded politely, pulling out the passenger manifest on her tablet. A few quick taps, a brief scan, and then, "Actually, Mr. Stokes is in his correct seat," she said, her tone polite but firm. "Your ticket says 2A, and he's in 2B. Patricia's entire body stiffened. That wasn't the answer she had expected. She blinked, tilting her head slightly, forcing a small, confused laugh. "Are you sure?" Emily nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Everything checks out." Patricia's fingers tightened subtly around the armrest. How could this be happening? How could no one else see the problem here? She hesitated for just a second too long, her mind racing, searching for the right response. But before she could say anything else, before she could push back, the flight attendant smiled politely and took a step back. "Let me know if you need anything else," Emily said, then turned and walked away. Patricia's jaw clenched. The weight in her chest grew heavier. The man beside her, Mr. Stokes, was still typing, unbothered, untouched, as if this entire conversation was beneath him. Patricia exhaled sharply, her fingers drumming against the armrest. Fine. If no one else was going to do anything about this, if they weren't going to handle it, then she would. Because this wasn't over, not by a long shot. A hush fell over the cabin, thick and suffocating, as Daniel Stokes calmly reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. His movements were slow, deliberate, not rushed, not anxious, not defensive. Patricia watched, her breath caught in her throat, her mind scrambling to predict his next move. For a split second, she expected something dramatic, maybe a boarding pass, maybe a direct challenge. Maybe he'd finally speak up, defend himself, argue with her the way she was used to people arguing when they were cornered. But he didn't do any of that. Instead, he pulled out a small black leather case, and then, with the same calm, unshakable confidence he had displayed since the moment she first laid eyes on him, he flipped it open and held it up just enough for her and the flight attendant to see. The cabin's silence deepened. The passengers closest to them leaned in slightly, catching the unmistakable glint of gold. An FBI badge. Patricia felt her stomach lurch, her breath catching in her chest. The air around her shifted, as if the plane itself had tilted ever so slightly beneath her seat. For a moment, her brain refused to process what she was seeing. She blinked. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Daniel Stokes didn't say anything right away. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He didn't even look at her with the triumph she would have expected if their roles had been reversed. He just sat there, holding the badge steadily in his hand, his dark eyes locked onto hers, as if waiting for the weight of her own actions to crash down on her. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, even unreadable. "Ma'am," he said smoothly, tilting his head ever so slightly, "would you like to file an official complaint? I can take your statement right now." The words hit her like a physical blow. Patricia flinched. She could feel the eyes on her now, passengers who had been watching in quiet discomfort, now staring openly, fully engaged. Some of them smirked, others whispered. A businessman a few rows ahead let out a soft, amused chuckle. The young woman who had been pretending to text, she wasn't pretending anymore. She was still recording. Patricia's throat tightened. Her mind was racing, trying to grab onto anything, any justification, any excuse, any way to wriggle out of the trap she had so confidently walked into. But there was no way out. Not this time. She knew what this meant. An accusation like hers against a federal agent wasn't something that could be brushed aside as a misunderstanding. She had backed herself into a corner, because now she either had to double down on her claim or admit in front of everyone that she had made the entire thing up. Patricia swallowed, her skin burning with a prickling heat. She couldn't speak. She couldn't even move. Daniel Stokes continued to watch her, his face impassive, patient, as if he already knew what she was going to do next, as if he had seen this exact scenario play out before. Because maybe, just maybe, he had. Patricia's lips trembled slightly. She knew the game was over, and she had lost. The silence stretched. Her fingers curled tightly around the edge of her armrest, nails pressing into the leather, her knuckles white. And then, finally, her voice, small and shaky, no complaint. Daniel nodded once, not smugly, not triumphantly, just expectantly, as if this was the inevitable outcome, as if this was how it always ended. And just like that, it was over. At least for him. For Patricia, it was only the beginning. A few passengers murmured their approval. A couple even clapped softly, amused by the instant karma. Patricia's ears burned as the whispers rippled through the cabin. Did she really just try to pull that? Unbelievable. FBI? Oh, that's priceless. The businessman who had been watching from across the aisle shook his head, letting out a quiet laugh before turning back to his newspaper. The flight attendant, Emily, lingered for a moment longer, her gaze flicking between Patricia and Daniel. "Will that be all, Ma'am?" Emily asked finally, her tone polite, but no longer carrying the warmth it had before. Patricia forced herself to nod, her throat too dry to speak. Emily turned to Daniel instead, her expression softening. "Mr. Stokes, if you need anything during the flight, don't hesitate to ask." A sharp contrast. A clear message. Daniel nodded once. "Appreciate it." Emily gave him a small, respectful nod before walking away. The flight resumed as if nothing had happened. Daniel reopened his laptop, his fingers returning to the keyboard with the same ease as before, as if the entire confrontation had been nothing more than a mild inconvenience, as if Patricia Langford didn't even exist. And somehow, that was the worst part of all. The flight continued, conversations picked back up, passengers turned their attention elsewhere, but Patricia could still feel it, the weight of their judgment, the subtle glances from across the aisle, the girl with the phone, still recording, her fingers clenched in her lap. She had come onto this plane expecting quiet luxury, an effortless experience, and instead, she had just humiliated herself in front of everyone. Patricia kept her gaze forward, forcing herself to breathe, forcing herself to pretend that everything was fine, that she could still salvage this, that no one would remember, that this moment would pass. But then her phone buzzed, once, twice, a third time, and deep down she already knew. She had just become the main character of the internet's latest viral story, and there was no stopping what came next. Her phone vibrated again, then again. Each buzz sent a fresh wave of panic through her chest. Patricia clenched her jaw and reached into her handbag with trembling fingers, fishing out her phone like it was a live grenade. The screen was already glowing. Dozens of notifications, text messages, missed calls, email alerts, and then Twitter. Her breath hitched as she saw the trending tab. Her name, her full name, trending. Her pulse roared in her ears as she tapped the notification. The moment the page loaded, her stomach plummeted. The video. The one she had desperately hoped wasn't real. The one she had convinced herself was just the overactive imagination of a nosy young passenger who would never actually do anything with it. It was right there, and it had already been viewed over 1.2 million times. Her vision blurred as she scrolled, hundreds, no, thousands of comments, each one a punch to the gut. This lady really thought she could pull this off in 2025, LMAO. She tried to get an FBI agent kicked out of first class. I'm actually crying. Her face when he pulled out that badge, instant regret. Imagine paying thousands for a flight only to ruin your entire life before takeoff. She scrolled faster, as if she could outrun the avalanche of ridicule. But it just kept getting worse. Someone had posted a side-by-side screenshot, her face frozen in shock, and Daniel's badge gleaming in his hand. A meme had already started, and the worst part, the caption. "When you phone around and immediately find out." Patricia's hands shook as she gripped the phone. Her name was being dragged. Her face was being shared. She was being exposed. She glanced around the cabin, her breath coming short and fast. The passengers who had witnessed everything were now casually scrolling their own phones, some still glancing her way, some smirking, others whispering. She tried to convince herself that this would blow over, that it was just a moment of internet hysteria, but the vibration in her hand told her otherwise. Her phone rang. She swallowed hard as she looked at the caller ID. Her sister. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Then another call came in. A different number, another one. More texts. "Patricia, is this you? Please tell me this isn't real. You're all over the internet." She felt a crushing weight settle on her chest. She had thought the worst part of this ordeal was the humiliation in the cabin. She was wrong. The worst part was the world watching it unfold. And it wasn't stopping any time soon. By the time the plane landed, Patricia was holding on to a desperate, fragile hope. Maybe this would all disappear once she was on solid ground. Maybe the internet would move on to something else. Maybe, if she kept her head down, no one at the airport would recognize her. She stepped off the plane as quickly as she could, ignoring the hushed voices behind her, ignoring the way the flight attendants seemed colder now, the way they barely spared her a glance. She just needed to get to baggage claim, get in a car, get home. But as she reached the terminal, her stomach clenched. They were waiting for her. Not a huge crowd, not yet, but enough. A small group of reporters stood near the baggage claim, phones and cameras poised, scanning the arriving passengers. Patricia's breath caught. They were looking for her. Her feet faltered for half a second. She could turn back. She could walk to another exit, slip away before they noticed. And then one of them spotted her. A woman in a navy blazer, microphone in hand. Her face lit up with recognition. She turned sharply toward her camera operator, whispering something before, "Wait, that's her. That's Patricia Langford." Patricia's stomach dropped. A few heads turned, others followed, and then the floodgates opened. "Miss Langford, do you have a response to the viral video? Miss Langford, did you know he was an FBI agent? Do you regret trying to have him removed?" Patricia sucked in a sharp breath, her body tensing as panic spiked through her. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She turned sharply, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she hurried in the opposite direction. The voices followed. She reached for her phone, fumbling with it, her mind screaming for a solution. Her ride. She needed her ride. Her fingers moved too fast, hitting the wrong buttons. She exhaled sharply, blinking hard to clear her vision. Another voice called out from behind her. "Miss Langford, do you think you were being racist?" Her breath hitched. She spotted a taxi pulling up outside. She didn't hesitate. She ran. She pushed past travelers, ignoring the startled gasps, the quiet murmurs. She shoved the door open and threw herself into the back seat of the cab, slamming it shut behind her. "Go!" she snapped at the driver. "Now!" The man raised an eyebrow, looking at her through the rearview mirror. For a brief, horrible second, she thought he was going to refuse. But then, without a word, he put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb. Patricia pressed her hands to her temples, squeezing her eyes shut. Her chest rose and fell with each labored breath. She had escaped, for now. But as her phone buzzed again, as more missed calls flashed across the screen, as she refreshed the video, watching the view count skyrocket past 2 million, she realized something chilling. She could run from the airport. She could run from the reporters. She could even run from the passengers on that plane, but she could not run from the internet. and this nightmare was just beginning. Patricia sat in the back of the taxi, gripping the phone in her shaking hands. The city lights blurred past the window, streaks of gold and red against the evening sky. Her world, her carefully curated, respectable, prestigious world, was collapsing around her, and she had no idea how to stop it. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the moment she landed. Calls, texts, emails. She scrolled through them, her fingers numb. Her colleagues, her friends, her family. "Patricia, what is going on? I saw the video. Is this you? You need to say something." Now, her heart pounded as she switched over to Twitter, hoping, praying, that maybe the momentum had died down. It hadn't. 2.8 million views. Her name was in headlines. Entitled "Woman Tries to Remove Black Passenger, Instantly Regrets It." FBI agent silences racist woman on first-class flight. Meet Patricia Langford, the internet's newest Karen. Her stomach churned. They knew her name. They knew who she was. Her picture was everywhere now. Screenshots of her face mid-argument, clips of her gasping in shock when Daniel pulled out his badge, memes of her sitting there humiliated. They had found her Facebook, her LinkedIn, her past job history. People were tagging companies she was affiliated with, demanding they respond. And then, her worst fear confirmed. A tweet from the Marston Foundation. "The Marston Foundation has been made aware of a video involving one of our board members, Patricia Langford. We do not condone discrimination of any kind. An official statement will follow." Her breath caught. Her chest tightened. She fumbled with her phone, her shaking fingers barely managing to dial the number before pressing it to her ear. It rang once, twice, then, "Patricia, James Rollins, chairman of the Marston Foundation." His voice was clipped, controlled, no warmth, no familiarity. She forced herself to swallow. "James, we're going to need you to step down." The words hit her like ice water. Her throat closed. "Wait, James, please, just let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," he said flatly. "The board has already voted. We'll be issuing a public statement in the morning." Patricia gripped the phone tighter, her nails digging into the casing. "You don't understand. It wasn't—" "I understand perfectly," James interrupted. A pause. Then, his voice even lower, "You brought this on yourself." Click. The line went dead. Patricia stared at the phone, the weight of his words settling deep into her bones. She wanted to throw it. She wanted to scream. Instead, she sat there, frozen. Her reputation, her career, gone. All because of a moment, because of a decision she had made without thinking. A decision she had been so sure she could control. But there was no controlling this. She wasn't just losing her job. She was losing everything. She turned her head slowly, staring out the window as the taxi moved through the city. This wasn't supposed to happen to her. She had always believed she was untouchable, respected, above things like this. But the world had changed. People weren't staying silent anymore. Actions had consequences, and for the first time in her life, she was the one facing them. The taxi pulled up in front of her building and she stepped out like a ghost, her body moving but her mind somewhere far away. She didn't even remember walking inside. All she knew was that the moment she shut the door behind her, her knees finally gave out. She slid down against the wall, her head in her hands, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she cried. Meanwhile, miles away, in a sleek office with floor-to-ceiling windows, Daniel Stokes barely even thought about the flight. His phone vibrated with a notification. He glanced at it, saw a link to the video. He sighed. He had seen this story play out before. It wasn't new, it wasn't shocking. Just another day. He shook his head, exhaled, and closed the notification. There was work to be done. And unlike Patricia Langford, he wasn't about to waste time dwelling on what had already been decided. Because in the end, some people learn their lesson the hard way, and some people, they never learn at all. This is what happens when privilege meets accountability. Some people will never understand the weight of their actions until the world refuses to ignore them. We all have a choice in how we treat others. We all have a moment, a single moment, where we can decide to do the right thing, or let ignorance speak for us. Patricia made her choice. She thought her status would protect her. She thought the rules didn't apply to her. But the truth is, no one is above consequences. The internet saw her for what she was. And now the only thing left is the question that really matters. If this had been you, what would you have done? Let's talk about it in the comments.